Today we're talking about the crisis of government competence. So what do policymakers do when they don't know what they're doing? That's the question that motivates much of my research. And the answer that I give to that question is that it depends. It depends on whether policymakers recognize that they don't know what they're doing or not. When policymakers see that they've been asked to try to achieve a goal that they don't know how to achieve, they tend to, I argue, engage in political theater. That is, they tend to pretend like they know what they're doing, or otherwise they engage in public relations activities that are meant to distract the public from the fact that they don't know what they're doing. On the other hand, when policymakers believe falsely that they do know what they're doing, when they act on the basis of false beliefs, there's a tendency for things to go wrong. So when policymakers recognize that they don't know what they're doing, I think COVID is a perfect example of this. What you tend to get is political theater. You tend to get efforts on the part of policymakers to convince their constituents that they do know what they're doing. Or otherwise, you get public relations efforts meant to distract the public from the ignorance of the policymaker. On the other hand, when policymakers don't know that they don't know what they're doing, they tend to act on the basis of their false beliefs. So, for example, an instance of this occurred during the Iraq War, when believing falsely that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction.
Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources.
We were acting on the basis of this false belief. And perhaps if we had known beforehand that there were no weapons of mass destruction, that whole historical episode would have turned out very differently. When did the crisis of competence first emerge? I think that the crisis of competence it sort of waxes and wanes, but historically, the United States and Western countries emerged out of World War II really confident in their abilities to use government to solve various problems.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens.
And particularly, we came out of World War II very confident in our military capacities and our military capabilities. So I think the crisis or concerns about competence really started to emerge during the late Vietnam era, when it became somewhat obvious that our policymakers did not know how to win that war, or even, in President Nixon's famous phrase, how to lose it with honor, how to find peace with honor.
We today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
What recent events have exacerbated the crisis? Well, I think that the COVID pandemic, number one, is probably the most obvious example of a context in which our policymakers tried and obviously failed to address a problem. Rather than policies that actually effectively minimized harm from the crisis, from the pandemic, what we had were ineffective lockdowns, counterproductive school closures, mask mandates, social distancing, none of which seemed to actually address the problem at all.
Today I want to talk to you about distance learning, talk to you about a package of educational investments and donations that we've been able to organize to help support our 6+ million kids that are not physically in the classroom,
but seem to create a whole bunch of other problems socially and economically. And then, of course, moving on from COVID, you have January 6th. Then you have the Biden presidency. You have the awful, disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, which the Biden administration tried to portray as a success. Then you have the economic policies of the Biden administration, all of which, we were promised were not going to lead to inflation, but obviously did. So, over the course of the last 5 years, there have just been a series of events that have seem to indicate that our policymakers really don't know what they're doing and may not even care to know what they're doing. One obvious question is, what, if anything, can be done to address the competency crisis? I argue in my research that the crisis is to some extent a reflection of the fact that citizens don't quite understand the limitations of policymakers. We tend to expect more from policymakers than they can actually achieve. So I think that one way that we could find ourselves less disappointed in our governments would be to lower our expectations, right? To ask less from our governments. To give you an example, I think that our government, we have a lot of evidence to suggest that our government knows how to address issues like infrastructure. We have no evidence to suggest that our policymakers know how to fix problems like racism or homelessness. or whatever problem, whatever domestic social problem you might think of. We've been trying to solve racism in this country for 200 years. I think we've made some progress, but it's an open question how much of that progress has been due to the decisions of our policymakers rather than just due to spontaneous social change that has occurred in our attitudes with regard to the races. So one way to address the crisis would be to just lower our expectations, to ask less of government. What about DOGE, you might ask? Well, I mean, I think DOGE is a move in the right direction. Obviously, DOGE is doing some of what I just suggested, that we should limit the government, rein in some of its activities, make it simpler and smaller. My worry about DOGE, though, is that this kind of attitude that they seem to have about move fast and break things, that could be a recipe for just more problems in the future. So my slogan would be not move fast and break things, but think carefully and move with some trepidation. And I think DOGE is moving in the right direction. I think they're doing things, they're addressing the major problems first and kind of moving towards the more complicated, the more controversial problems later. But I think that it's a good approach. It's a good idea. We definitely need it. I just want them to be a little bit careful in how they do things. If anything that I say today you disagree with, I'd love to hear your feedback. Tell me why I'm wrong.